Welcome to Pivot Points, a new series featuring some of the world's most successful women, candidly sharing their stories and insights about how they made it to the top and how you can too. Hosted by Perry Yeatman, a straight-talking global executive and award-winning author who created the career and life of her dreams and now wants to help other ambitious women do the same.
Welcome. This is Perry Yeatman, the host of Pivot Points. I am so happy to introduce our next guest to you. I am personally indebted to her for the opportunities and the experiences she gave me, and I know a lot of other women are too. She has made everyone's list of most powerful women, Financial Times, Fortune, Forbes, you name it, she's been at the top of it. In our house, she was known as the Big Cheese. Back when I worked for her, when I lived out in Chicago, and this was the name my 5-year-old gave her, and I just loved that she actually thought it was funny. But of course, by now you've probably guessed, I'm talking about Irene Rosenfeld. She is the chairman and CEO of Mondelez International, the global snacking powerhouse, and the home of some of our family's favorite brands, including Oreo, Nabisco, Cadbury, and Trident. Irene, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be with you, Perry.
So obviously, you are at the top of the top, but every journey had to begin somewhere. So what would you think is the first job that really kind of launched you and set the trajectory for your career?
I've thought a lot about that question because it comes up a lot in many conversations. And I think for my career, the opportunity to run Kraft Canada fairly early on in my career was a really important launching ground. And it was important for a couple of reasons. One is that it was the first time that I had an entirely freestanding business to run. It was in another country, and so I had some of the cultural dynamics to deal with. And it was the opportunity to really manage our whole portfolio of products. Up until that time, I had been in charge of one or two or a small portfolio. This was now the entire portfolio of Kraft. And I think about that opportunity a lot because I actually think if I had not raised my hand, I'm not sure it would have come my way.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think one of my very most important pieces of advice that I give to folks as they're moving along in their career is to ask for what you want, to know what you want, and then be prepared to ask for it. In my case, I happen to have been at a dinner, just a routine dinner, check-in dinner with my boss at the time, and he asked me the usual question, if you could have any job, what would you want? And at that point, there were really only two jobs. At that moment, I was running the desserts business for General Foods. I had run the beverage division prior to that. And at that point, there were really only two jobs that were of any interest to me. One was Oscar Mayer, and the other was Kraft Canada. And my interest in both of those was because they were fully integrated businesses that had their own sales force and all their own functional resources. And that would have been a different experience relative to what I had been doing, not to mention that they both had a very broad portfolio of products. And so I mentioned those two opportunities to my boss, knowing full well that those were not available. They were both run by very talented leaders at that time. And unbeknownst to me, the Kraft Canada job was about to open up. And so within 2 weeks' time, I got a call asking me if I would consider Kraft Canada. In fact, I was told that there really was a sense that I might not be willing to move. And so had I not mentioned it, I'm not even sure I would have been on the short list. And as I said, it was, for me, a giant step up in terms of responsibility, in terms of perspective, and it really, I think, was one of the most culminating experiences that I had up until then, and I would say has withstood the test of time.
That's great. And thank you so much for sharing that, because I think what I take away from that story is several things. As you said, it's about ask for what you want, raise your hand. But there's also a degree of serendipity. And if you don't do that, as you said, you put this on the table before you even knew that it was going to be open. And so there is a degree to which there's luck. And so I think a lot of women, we hesitate or we wait to see what the obvious path is. So you might say, what are the three things that are available? And then I'll choose from those. But you actually put something on the table that wasn't even available, at least as far as you knew. And it
well, in fact, I think it's I think it's a similar skill in terms of why I believe networking is so important, because you just never know who you're talking to and what might be going on elsewhere in their own lives or in their portfolio of opportunities. And so I do believe very, very much in serendipity. I also believe in that old Japanese saying that it's when preparedness meets opportunity. So I think there's a real combination there that I think can be very powerful.
Excellent. Thank you. So you obviously, you made it through the launch, and you were in, kind of your mid-career. I happen to know that you're married and you have 2 girls. I think a lot of women, when they talk about like what is one of the number one derailers for women's careers, it is often that people kind of throw in the towel at that mid-career point where it is so tough to do a great job and then also be managing a spouse and caregiving responsibilities and kids. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of choices and compromises did you make, and how did you make it work?
There's no question it is a challenge. I think we do ourselves a little bit of a disservice when people talk about work-life balance. You have this sense that somehow there's a scale and everything at any moment in time is perfectly aligned, and that just isn't the way it is. And so I certainly found in my own career that there's no question there's a pull between your spouse or your partner with the job and the family. And my own experience is that any 2 out of those 3 have to be in some reasonable alignment. It is rarely the case that all 3 will be in alignment at the same time. But I think if you can make sure you understand what's necessary at a given time to keep 2 of the 3 in balance, that's what worked well for me. I'll give you an example. For me, as a working mom, back to school time was always the most difficult time of the year. It was my busiest time in business because that was often when we were putting together our annual plans. Mm-hmm. And it was typically the time when my 2 girls were starting school and we were into a whole new schedule, a whole new set of extracurricular activities. And so the ability to understand what was coming up and what accommodations I needed to make at that time were really important to me in terms of my ability to make it all work. I am happy to say I think it's a much more vibrant topic today. I think it is much more a topic for both mothers and fathers. And I think most employers, recognizing that there is great value in being a desirable place to work, are willing to take on the challenges of working around some of the family considerations.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just say, as I said in the beginning, I remember days when you and I had to work on a Saturday or I need to drop something off or whatever. And I always just so appreciated knowing that you were a mother. I so appreciated the fact that I was an SVP, but I had a 3-year-old and I didn't want to give her up. And I think we were very lucky at what was then Kraft because you didn't make me give her up. Like, I got to talk about her with you. She was often in the car when I would drop something off. It's why she called you the Big Cheese, because she knew all about you and you were not somebody who was inapproachable to her. So I think that makes a lot of difference. And you're right. I think that while we were very lucky at Kraft to have a lot of senior women around us, I think that now other organizations are really beginning to do the same things and to recognize that there's real power and advantage in being able to make these, what are often small accommodations, in order to get a big benefit.
I also would say it brings you back a little bit to this idea of ask for what you want. I think all too often employees are very anxious to please. They want to do whatever it is their boss asks for, and they are very reluctant to push back and say, do you have to have that by tomorrow? Can I get it to you by Friday? But very often I have found that when you create an environment that makes it feasible to ask those kinds of questions, very often the answer is it doesn't have to be tomorrow, and all of a sudden a whole burden has been lifted from your shoulders that you might have felt otherwise. So I think there's a lot more room in today's work environment to have those kinds of conversations, both in a situational manner as well as in a broader sense, as you described, of just talking about families. I mean, one of the things I'm so proud of that we have done here in our offices is that our artwork are pictures of our employees with their families eating our products. And it's a matter of great pride for the employees, and it just it sends a really powerful signal, I think, to folks that come and visit us.
It's so funny that you mentioned that example because Kirsten, my daughter, is actually still on the wall at Mondelez and she's eating mac and cheese. And we actually have that picture in our home as well because it was so wonderful to come home and to know that like my family loved the products that I made and that I, of course I didn't physically make them, but the ones I was helping promote and make successful. And I think that engagement between work and family and bringing it, the work into home and home into work really, it makes a difference. That's great. So
yes.
You have done more deals than almost anybody I can think of. I mean, you and I used to talk about how, kind of 7 years at Kraft or at Mondelez, it was like 14, it was like dog years, right? It was an exponential learning experience because there was so much stuff going on. By many accounts, you would have to be considered an amazing negotiator. I'm not saying you would say that about yourself, but your track record would indicate you really do know how to put together a deal and make it happen. So what would be your tips for somebody at the lower levels trying to negotiate personally or professionally for what they want? You said ask for it. Are there other things that you would recommend that they do?
Well, my advice in a negotiation is always to put yourself to, first of all, again, know what you want and then put yourself in the shoes of the person you are negotiating with. It is critically important that you understand what their motivators are, what their pinch points are, and that makes for a very robust conversation. So, I'll give you an example. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with my own daughters as they have taken various jobs. The initial salary was not quite what they wanted or they were asking for. What should they do? The facts are it doesn't hurt you to ask. In fact, if anything, I think often an employer has more respect for you if you stand up for yourself. You have to do it in a respectful way. You have to not be unreasonable. But I think it is not acceptable to end up with an outcome that is not what you wanted. You should take full responsibility for making sure you understand what you want and for going for it. And the worst that somebody can say to you is no.
And, that's one of those things that a lot of people ask me, I took some pretty big risks when I moved to Singapore or Russia or London or whatever. People always say, weren't you scared? And I said, well, actually, of course I was scared. You're always nervous, if you will. But what I always thought was, what's the worst thing that could happen? And as long as the worst thing that could happen was something I could live with, then I thought, okay, why not go for it?
And I think that's actually a great way to think about any potential career risks or life risks, because once you actually take yourself down that path and you conclude that it's not so terrible, it gives you so much more confidence and courage to then do what you think is the right thing to do.
So as we've talked about, you are at the top. There's so much noise in the system these days about women that, first of all, as men move up, they're more liked. And as it turns out, women are less liked. Even as individuals, that would be, a very different thing. But from a promotional standpoint, they just become less liked. Women are much more harshly scrutinized, and not just on performance, where I think that's completely fair, but actually on all sorts of other things in terms of their looks or their parenting. How have you handled these things, which really are, they're real, but in order to succeed, you kind of have to figure out how to manage them because they're not going away.
Yeah, one of the very first books that somebody gave me many years ago was Dress for Success. And although it's incredibly aggravating, there's a reality to that. I do think how you present yourself, whether you like it or not, people form an impression of you in very short order. And so I do think there is something about appearance. I am as aggravated as you are and most other women are about the disproportionate emphasis. I was so annoyed when Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State, and instead of discussing who she was negotiating with and what the treaty was, we were discussing what kind of earrings she was wearing and what color.
Exactly.
So there is just a reality. We're a little more colorful. I think we make for some more interesting copy. But I think at the end of the day, the most important focus has got to be on delivering. And the truth of the matter is, if you perform, the rest of it does take care of itself. People can just not ignore people that are performing. And I do think there is a disproportionate focus on some of the wrong things with respect to analyzing female leaders. I'm delighted to see, I think it has subsided, in the early days of Angela Merkel's leadership and Margaret Thatcher. You would read a lot more of that kind of nonsense. I think it has died down quite a bit. I'm grateful to see, even as we watch the U.S. presidential primaries, I think we're finding that there's a lot less discussion of what Hillary's wearing. But at the end of the day, it's all about whether you're competent and whether you can deliver. And your focus has got to be on making sure that people understand that.
The adage, it's lonely at the top, is, I think, largely accepted because at the end of the day, while you have an amazing team around you, the buck does stop with you. And I know that can sit very heavily on a lot of people's shoulders. But for women, it's even more so because there are, frankly, fewer of us at the top. And it's also, I think that we do, the research would indicate we still do carry a disproportionate burden for caregiving and other home tasks. So there's just not a lot of free time. But you said at the beginning how important networking is. But talk to us a little bit more about what is your support system and how did you create it? How do you find female friends and how do you keep them even at your level?
Well, first of all, I do think female friends and colleagues are so important. There is no question we approach the world in a slightly different way. And so it is very cathartic and very comforting to have the opportunity to talk with other women. Sometimes the men are not as willing to be candid. They're not as transparent about what they're worried about. So I have found that there's value. I have an enormous number of male colleagues that I spend time with and whose opinions I value greatly. But I do have a special place in my heart and in my life for my female colleagues. And I think the simple answer is over time, you just meet people that you connect with. I had the experience of meeting a woman who wrote my speeches for me for a number of years, and I did not know her before. We got to know each other in the context of her doing my speech writing, and we became fast friends. So I do think it's about having a variety of experiences, being open to meeting new people and establishing those relationships. And even today, she doesn't write my speeches anymore, but we still go out to dinner every couple of months. There's just, a real common bond and a real camaraderie there.
Yeah, that's great. And I do agree. I mean, I think that I have found myself that there's something about a connection with a woman where you can really let your hair down. And I think that at some point, I mean, you have to style flex. You have to be a little bit, thoughtful about your perception in the office, et cetera. But at some point, you've got to be able to completely be yourself and be at ease and be able to let out whatever it is that's going on in your life or in your world. And for me, at least, I have found that the majority of those specific support relationships happen to end up being women, even though some of my best friends are guys. But it is the women who I turn to when I want to kind of vent about something.
I would say, though, one of my other lessons learned in the course of my career is my perception of how much I couldn't let down my hair in the office has changed greatly over the years, and in the sense that there's great value in being a lot more open and transparent than I might have realized in the early days of my career. Now, in fairness, part of it was just the world was a different place. I think there wasn't as much willingness to understand and acknowledge family and some of the other things that might have been going on. So I think that may have played a role. But I find at this stage of my career, my willingness to share what's going on in my life. My daughter got married a couple of weeks ago, and it was a big deal for me, of course.
Congratulations.
I talked a lot about it. Thank you. I talked a lot about it, and I can't tell you how cute it's been. I get all these notes from people. How did it go? Send me pictures. And I think there's real value because I think you find when you're willing to open up with them, they in turn are willing to open up with you. Interestingly, though, I would say the number of comments I have gotten have come disproportionately from my female employees.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're right. I mean, we read a lot about it in terms of authentic leadership. And I have to say that what always amazed me was that you were who you were, right? Even when I was trying to advise you to do something different, whether it was stylistically or whatever, it was like you had to be, you taught me you had to be comfortable in your own skin and you had to eliminate those distractions. So there are people who aren't going to like this or that or whatever. It's like, it's okay. You just have to be who you are. And I think that when people do feel you are being your authentic self, then that's when trust and respect. I mean, those things are much easier to give to somebody when you actually feel you know who you're talking to. So I think you're right. I had underestimated that. So that was a good lesson for me.
I also think, I think the people are a lot more selective in today's world about the nature of the company they're going to work for and who their boss is. And so in that context, it becomes that actually almost imperative to be able to provide that kind of perspective.
Yeah, you're right. And of course, it's so much more transparent, right? It's not like you can hide it anyway, because people are being able to see your life in so many places, and everything is marked and noted. So I agree with you. I think that not only is it very hard, but there is no benefit anymore to trying to be somebody else, because eventually it's going to come out. Yep. So looking back, I don't know any successful woman who hasn't had to overcome, some bad breaks or big failures or been on the receiving end of some really unacceptable behavior. Since none of these things clearly derailed your career, would you be willing to share with listeners something that happened to you that, was embarrassing or didn't go well? And how did you handle it? And what did you learn from it?
One in particular, I had a really difficult boss at one point in my career. And no matter how hard I worked and no matter how much effort I put into the relationship, she was just inclined not to be supportive. I ultimately made the decision to leave the company because I kind of banged my head against the wall and then realized it wasn't going anywhere. So I think the big lesson I have learned is that you will, over the course of time, work with people who you don't enjoy. When it starts to influence your own head and your own psyche, you got to extricate yourself. And I think for me, having had a variety of experiences over the course of my career with folks that I didn't enjoy working with so much, that to me has been a really important lesson. Basically, you got to stay true to yourself. If you can't in that situation, you got to get out of the situation. To try to shape yourself in someone else's image or to be acceptable to someone that you can't relate to is extremely draining, and ultimately I don't think it's a good recipe for success.
I used to always feel that if you can't really bring yourself to the office, or you feel like you're constantly on guard trying to figure out this or that or whatever, that it's really hard to then put the passion and the excitement that you need to be great. I mean, I think if you just aren't really revved about an opportunity, then it's hard to keep charging the way you need to keep charging. And so I would agree with you. Looking back, if you had an opportunity to talk to your 20-year-old self, would you have changed anything? What would you tell that person in terms of any advice you would give and how you might have done anything differently?
I was in a big rush when I was in my 20s. I was
only in your 20s?
Getting a PhD. Wow, I haven't changed all that much. I was getting a PhD. I wanted to, I had the opportunity. My husband was his advisor was transferred to Europe. We had the opportunity to live in Europe for about 6 months, and I didn't want to go because I was, had to finish my stuff. So I think I would have taken a little more time to do what I wanted to do, and that I think in hindsight, it would have been fabulous to have lived in Europe, and those 6 months in the scheme of life were kind of irrelevant. I think the other piece is I probably would have moved around a lot more. I was about 18 years in the same place in New York before I took my first move. And, in today's world especially, I think willingness to move to different locations, and certainly, Perry, your own career has been a real testament to that. I think I would have been a lot more receptive to that opportunity than I was at the time.
Mm-hmm. No, it makes sense. And I agree. I mean, certainly I feel like so much of my learning came from moving, and it was geographic moves, company moves, functional moves. Every one of them was tough, but every one of them was just exponential growth. And at the end of the day, that's really all you can ask for is a job that's letting you add value and grow. So I'm a huge proponent of people working overseas and getting out of their comfort zone. So I agree with you.
I've been mentoring one of the guys that was an intern for us, is now at Harvard Business School, and he's now going to graduate. And I was talking to him the other day. I've been a mentor of his, and I so loved his perspective, which was, I just want to collect a portfolio of experiences. And, I'm not sure where they all lead, but I think gone are the days, and it's a good thing, where, you have to put your time in, you do this for 2 years, you do that for 2 years. And I think there's so much more opportunity in the world today to be able to collect a variety of experiences that are interesting to you. And I think the message to my 20-year-old self would have been, go for it.
Yeah, again, what's the worst that can happen? Might as well go for it. Yep. So as we get to the end of this interview, you have been able to, by all accounts and by almost any measure of success, to been able to craft the career and the life of your dreams. I'm not saying it was all perfect, but it certainly seems like you have been able to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish. What would you tell other women who may be at the launch phase or in the mid-career phase who are seeking to do the same? What would be your kind of ultimate piece of advice to them, or a couple pieces of advice?
I think it is about really understanding what turns you on. I have no, I'm not sympathetic to folks that are just sort of putting in their time to get to the next job. Life's too short, and I think, your willingness to understand who you are, what you like, and to then go for that, is a really important part of your success, because, there's no question, if you are passionate about what you're doing, you're better at it, and it doesn't feel like you're working. And so I think that would be my best advice, is to know yourself and do what turns you on.
I love that. And, I've often said many, many times to many different teams, my view is that life is not a spectator sport, right? And so it's kind of like, you just got to go in there. And sometimes I have, as you well know, I have certainly gone down in flames and made mistakes and whatever, but I always felt like every day my goal was to just do the best that I could, and to not, wimp out or to shy away from something because maybe it was hard or difficult or whatever. And if it worked or it didn't work, either way, I knew I was going to learn something, and I could pick myself up and dust myself back off. But you do have to go for it, because no one is going to make it happen for you. I mean, people will support you, and I have found just amazing support in my life and my career, but they can only support you on a journey that you put yourself on. And so you have to get out there and go for it.
Agreed.
Thank you so much, Irene. I know that our listeners will get so much out of this podcast, and I really appreciate your time, and I wish you much continued success.
Thanks, Perry. Great to talk with you.
You've been listening to Pivot Points, a series designed to help ambitious women have the careers and lives of their dreams. To hear more interviews, go to www.yourcareeryourterms.com. And be sure to tell us what you think. If there are topics you'd like covered or people you'd like interviewed, please let us know. We're here to give you